The old blue sedan rolled slowly down Main Street as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the small town of Pine Creek. Behind the wheel sat David Wilson, a tall man with kind eyes that had seen too much in his 23 years of police work. His son Andra, just 17 and full of dreams, gazed out the passenger window at their new home. "What do you think so far?" David asked, glancing at his son who had been quiet for most of the 3-hour drive. Andra shrugged, his fingers tapping nervously on his knee. "It's smaller than I thought." "And very?" He paused, searching for the right word. "White." David nodded, understanding his son's concern. Moving from the diverse city they called home to this small town wasn't easy, especially for a teenager. But the job offer to become chief of police was too good to pass up. "Give it time," David said softly. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen." As they drove down the main street, David noticed the curious glances from locals going about their business. Some smiled and waved, others stared a bit too long. David had decided not to announce his arrival until his official first day next week. He wanted to get a real feel for the town and the police department he would soon lead, without any fake smiles or special treatment. "I'm hungry," Andrew announced, breaking the silence. "Can we stop somewhere before checking into the hotel?" David spotted a diner with a blinking open sign. "How about there? Looks like a local spot." The bell above the door jingled as they entered the diner. The buzz of conversation dimmed slightly as heads turned toward them. David felt his son tense beside him, but gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Sit anywhere you like, folks," called a friendly waitress from behind the counter. They chose a booth by the window. Andrew buried his face in the menu while David observed the room. An older couple at the counter kept glancing their way. A group of men in work clothes huddled in the corner booth, one of them wearing a Pine Creek Police Department cap. "Think they know who you are?" Andrew whispered. David shook his head. "Not yet. And that's good. I want to see the real Pine Creek, not some show they put on for the new boss." The waitress came by, a smile genuine as she took their order. "You folks just passing through?" she asked. "Actually, we're moving here," David replied, starting fresh. "Well, welcome to Pine Creek. I'm Betty. Been serving food here since before this one was born." She nodded toward Andrew with a wink. As they ate their burgers, David noticed his son relaxing a bit, especially when Betty's teenage grandson came in, and she made a point of introducing him to Andrew. "See?" David said after the boy left, promising to show Andrew the best fishing spot in town. "Not so bad, right?" Andrew took a big bite of his burger to hide his small smile. "It's okay, I guess. Food's good at least." After lunch, they walked around the town square. There was a small park with a gazebo, a library, various shops, and the police station, a brick building with a flag fluttering outside. David paused across the street, taking it in. Starting Monday, that would be his responsibility. "That's it?" Andrew asked, sounding unimpressed. "Don't let the size fool you," David replied. "Small-town policing has its own challenges." As they continued their walk, David noticed how some people crossed the street when they saw them coming, while others nodded politely. Andrew noticed too. "You sure about this, Dad?" he asked quietly. "It's not too late to go back." David put his arm around his son's shoulders. "I'm sure. Every department needs good people, son. And sometimes the places that seem most resistant to change are the ones that need it most." They stopped at a small bookstore next. "Want to check it out?" David asked, knowing his son's love for science fiction novels. Andrew nodded, some excitement finally showing on his face. Neither of them could have guessed that what would happen next would change everything, not just for them, but for the entire town of Pine Creek. "I'll be right back," David said, pausing at the bookstore entrance. "Just want to find that mystery author I was telling you about." Andrew nodded, leaning against the brick wall outside. "Take your time. I'll wait here." As his father disappeared into the store, Andrew pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages from friends back home. The afternoon sun felt good on his face after the long drive. A few people walked by, some nodding politely, others pretending not to notice him. Andrew didn't see the police cruiser that pulled up slowly across the street, or the officer watching him with narrowed eyes. Not until a shadow fell across him and a gruff voice barked out, "Hey, what are you doing here?" Andrew looked up, startled to see Officer Ray Simmons standing too close, his hand resting on his belt near his holster. Simmons was in his 40s with a weathered face and cold eyes that had already decided who Andrew was before he'd said a word. "I'm just waiting for my dad, sir," Andrew replied, straightening up and putting his phone in his pocket. The movement seemed to make Simmons tense. "Your dad, huh?" Simmons said with obvious disbelief. "And where exactly is this dad of yours?" "He's inside the bookstore," Andrew said, pointing to the door behind him. He felt his heart beating faster, but kept his voice calm like his father had taught him. "He'll be out in a minute if you want to." "Don't point at me, boy," Simmons snapped, stepping even closer. "Let me see some ID." Andrew slowly reached for his wallet. "I'm just visiting town with my father." "Where?" "I didn't ask for your life story," Simmons cut him off. "ID. Now." A small crowd had started to gather across the street watching. An older woman looked concerned but didn't intervene. Two teenage boys whispered to each other, one filming with his phone. Andrew pulled out his student ID. "I'm 17. This is all I have." Simmons snatched the card, studying it with a scowl. "This isn't from around here. What are you really doing in Pine Creek? We don't need troublemakers here." "I'm not causing any trouble," Andrew said, his patience wearing thin despite his best efforts. "I'm literally just standing here waiting for my dad." "Watch your tone," Simmons warned, stepping closer. "You know, we get kids like you coming through town, thinking you can sell drugs or whatever else you're up to." Andrew couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Sir, I'm not selling anything. I'm just waiting for my father who is in that store right now." Right, Simmons said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The father who's conveniently not here. Let me guess, he's a lawyer too." "No, he's a police officer, actually," Andrew said, hoping this might change the officer's attitude. Simmons laughed out loud. "Now I know you're lying. Stand up straight and put your hands where I can see them." Andrew's phone buzzed in his pocket. "That's probably my dad texting me," he said, reaching slowly for his phone. "I can show you." It happened in a flash. Officer Simmons grabbed Andrew's wrist hard, twisting it. "I said hands where I can see them. You're hurting me." Andrew gasped, trying to pull away out of instinct. Simmons' face contorted with anger. "Stop resisting." And before Andrew could explain, the officer's fist connected with his jaw, a sharp, stunning pain that sent him sprawling onto the sidewalk. Andrew's ears rang as he touched his throbbing face, tasting blood where his lip had split against his teeth. People across the street gasped. The woman who had been watching finally stepped forward, calling out, "That wasn't necessary." Simmons ignored her, standing over Andrew with his hand on his taser now. "Stay down and don't move." Dazed, Andrew looked up just as the bookstore door swung open. His father stepped out, arms full of books, freezing at the sight before him, his son on the ground, blood on his face, and an officer standing over him with cold eyes and a clenched fist. The books dropped from David's hands, thudding against the sidewalk as father and son locked eyes, a silent moment of shared pain and fury before the real storm began. Time seemed to slow down as David took in the scene before him. His son on the ground, blood on his lip. The officer standing over him with a look of authority that quickly changed to annoyance at the interruption. "Sir, step back. This doesn't concern you," Officer Simmons said, not bothering to look at David properly. The crowd across the street had grown larger. Someone was still filming. David felt a surge of rage unlike anything he'd experienced in years, but 23 years of police work had taught him that losing control now wouldn't help his son. "It very much concerns me," David said, his voice dangerously quiet as he stepped forward. "That's my son." Officer Simmons finally looked at David, sizing him up with a dismissive glance. Your son was being uncooperative and reaching for something in his pocket. "My phone," Andrew said from the ground, his voice shaking slightly. "I was just reaching for my phone." David knelt beside Andrew, examining his face. The cut on his lip wasn't deep, but a bruise was already forming on his jaw. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. Andrew nodded, and David helped him to his feet, keeping himself between his son and Officer Simmons. "Sir, I need you both to stay right there while I run his information," Simmons said, his hand still hovering near his taser. No, you don't, David replied calmly. What you need to do is explain why you found it necessary to punch a 17-year-old boy who was simply waiting for his father. Something in David's tone made Simmons hesitate. The confidence in the stranger's eyes unsettled him. Look, I don't know who you think you are, Simmons began, but around here we don't tolerate. I know exactly who I am, David interrupted, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. I'm David Wilson, the new chief of police for Pine Creek. I start officially on Monday, but it seems I need to begin earlier than planned. He held out his credentials, and Officer Simmons' face went from red to ghostly white in seconds. The crowd across the street murmured. Someone let out a low whistle. I didn't know, Simmons stammered, suddenly at a loss for words. Nobody told me you were coming to town today. That was intentional, David said, putting his credentials away. I wanted to see how this town really operates when nobody's watching. He looked pointedly at Simmons. Now I know. The officer seemed to shrink under David's gaze. Chief Wilson, I can explain. We've had problems with outsiders coming through, and when I saw him, when you saw my black son standing in front of a bookstore, you made assumptions, David finished for him. And those assumptions led you to assault a minor without cause. An older man pushed through the crowd, wearing a police uniform with a captain's insignia. What's going on here, eh? He asked, then noticed Andrew's face. What happened to this young man? Captain Taylor, Simmons said, relief evident in his voice at the appearance of his superior. There was a misunderstanding. Captain, David said, extending his hand. David Wilson. I believe Mayor Green mentioned I'd be arriving this week. The captain's eyes widened in recognition. Chief Wilson? We weren't expecting you until Monday. Clearly, David replied, glancing at his son who was pressing a tissue to his lip. Captain Taylor looked from Simmons to Andrew and back to David, quickly grasping the situation. I think we should continue this conversation at the station, he said quietly. Fine, David agreed. But Officer Simmons rides in a separate car. I'll be bringing my son with me, and I don't want him anywhere near the officer who assaulted him. Dad, it's okay, Andrew said softly, touching his father's arm. I'm fine. David looked at his son, seeing not just the physical pain but the hurt of being treated like a criminal for simply existing. No, it's not okay, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. But it will be. As they walked toward the captain's car, the crowd parted silently. Officer Simmons stood rooted to the spot, the realization sinking in that he just punched the son of his new boss, a boss who had seen everything. In the distance, the town hall clock chimed 4 times, marking not just the hour, but the beginning of a change that would shake Pine Creek to its core. The motel room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional splash of water as David wrung out a washcloth in the bathroom sink. Andrew sat on the edge of the bed, holding an ice pack to his jaw, wincing as his father gently cleaned the cut on his lip. It's not that bad, Andrew said, though his voice was tight with pain. It shouldn't have happened at all, David replied, his calm tone masking the storm inside him. 3 hours in Pine Creek, and already his worst fears were being confirmed. The meeting at the police station had been tense. Captain Taylor had tried to smooth things over, suggesting maybe there was a misunderstanding. Officer Simmons had stammered through an explanation that sounded hollow even to his own ears. David had remained professional, but made it clear that this incident wouldn't be swept under the rug. What happens now? Andrew asked, watching his father put away the first aid supplies. David sat beside his son on the bed. Now we decide if we stay or go. Andrew looked surprised. You'd leave? Give up the job? In a heartbeat, David said without hesitation. Nothing is worth putting you in danger. The silence between them grew heavy as Andrew considered this. Finally, he spoke. If we leave, nothing changes here. The next kid who looks like me gets the same treatment, just no one will be there to stop it. David felt a mixture of pride and sadness at his son's words. At 17, Andrew understood too well how the world worked, knowledge no parent wanted their child to need. Besides, Andrew added with a small smile that made him wince again, you already dropped all that money on those books you never even got to buy. David laughed despite himself, grateful for his son's ability to find humor even now. We can always go back for them tomorrow. With a police escort this time? Andrew joked. A knock at the door interrupted them. David approached cautiously, checking through the peephole before opening it. Captain Taylor stood in the hallway, alone and looking uncomfortable. "Sorry to bother you, Chief Wilson. Could we talk for a minute?" David hesitated, looking back at Andra, who nodded. "It's okay, Dad. I'm just gonna rest anyway." David stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "What can I do for you, Captain?" "I wanted to apologize personally for what happened today," Taylor said, his voice low. "That's not who we are, or at least not who we should be." "Isn't it?" David challenged. "Because from where I stand, Officer Simmons felt pretty comfortable assaulting a teenager in broad daylight. That suggests he expected no consequences." Taylor's face flushed. "There's a lot you don't know about this town yet. Then enlighten me." Taylor glanced around the empty hallway. "Not everyone in the department is like Simmons. Some of us have been trying to change things from within, but it's been difficult." "Why?" David pressed. The old chief had his favorites. Simmons was one of them. They protected each other, looked the other way. Taylor paused. "When we heard the department was bringing in an outsider as chief, some of us were hopeful. Others not so much." David studied the captain's face, trying to decide if he was genuine. "And which group are you in, Captain?" "The hopeful one," Taylor answered. "My daughter married a black man 3 years ago. My grandkids are mixed. I don't want them growing up in a town where they get treated like your son did today." David hadn't expected this personal revelation. "What about the rest of the department?" "Split down the middle, I'd say. Some good officers who just want to do their jobs right. Others who, well, let's just say they've gotten comfortable with the old way of doing things." David nodded slowly. "And the town itself?" "Same split," Taylor replied. "But things can change." "They need to change." Back inside the room, Andrew was scrolling through his phone, looking at messages from friends back home. He looked up when his father returned. "Everything okay?" he asked. David sat heavily in the chair by the window, looking out at the small town that was supposed to be their fresh start. Lights were coming on as evening approached, the same stars appearing overhead as back in their old city, yet everything felt different. "Dad?" Andrew prompted. David turned to his son. "We're staying," he said firmly. "Sometimes the hardest places are where you're needed most." 2 weeks passed, and Pine Creek was buzzing with talk about the new police chief. Some people loved the changes he was making. Others weren't so happy. David sat at his desk reviewing complaint files from the past 5 years. The stack was taller than it should have been for a town this size. Many complaints had been filed against the same few officers, with Officer Simmons' name appearing most often. A knock on his open door made him look up. Captain Taylor stood there with coffee in hand. "Thought you could use this," he said, placing the cup on David's desk. "You've been at it since 6 this morning." David nodded his thanks. "These complaints, so many were dismissed without proper investigation." "I know," Taylor sighed. The old chief had his favorites. "Speaking of favorites," David said, "how's Officer Simmons handling his suspension?" After their meeting on David's first day, Simmons had been suspended without pay, pending a full investigation into the incident with Andra and his history of complaints. "Not well," Taylor replied. "He's been talking to his supporters in town, painting himself as the victim, says you're pushing some kind of agenda." David wasn't surprised. "And the rest of the department?" "Split, like I said before. Some officers are on board with the new training. Others think it's a waste of time." As if on cue, Officer Chen knocked on the doorframe. "Chief, we've got a situation at the community center. A group is gathering to protest your changes." David grabbed his jacket. "How many?" "About 30 people so far, but growing." "And sir?" Chen hesitated. "Officer Simmons is there." Outside the community center, a crowd had formed. Signs bobbed above their heads with messages like "Support our police" and "No new rules." Simmons stood on the steps, talking loudly to anyone who would listen. "He's turning our department upside down," Simmons was saying as David approached. "Putting good officers under a microscope while criminals get a free pass." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone shouted, "Go back where you came from." David felt a flash of anger, but kept his face calm as he walked toward the steps. The crowd parted reluctantly, some people glaring at him. Officer Simmons, David said, his voice carrying over the noise. I don't recall authorizing you to speak on behalf of the department. Simmons sneered. I'm speaking as a concerned citizen, Chief. Last I checked, that's still allowed. Of course it is, David agreed. Just as I'm allowed to remind everyone here that you're currently suspended for punching an unarmed teenager who was simply waiting for his father. A woman in the crowd shouted, your son was being disrespectful. Were you there, ma'am? David asked, turning to her. Well, no, but... Then you're repeating someone else's version of events, David said firmly. The truth is on video. Several people filmed it. My son was standing quietly when Officer Simmons approached him, made assumptions, and escalated the situation to violence. An older man pushed forward. This town was fine before you came along with your big city ideas. Was it? David challenged. Ask the mother whose son was pulled over 3 times in 1 week for looking suspicious. Ask the family who called for help during a domestic dispute and waited 40 minutes for an officer to arrive because they live on the wrong side of town. The crowd grew quieter as he spoke. I'm not here to tear down this department, David continued. I'm here to make it better. To make it work for everyone in Pine Creek, not just some. From the back of the crowd, Andrew appeared with several other teenagers, some white, some black, some Hispanic. They moved to stand behind David, a silent statement of support. Simmons' face darkened when he saw Andrew. This isn't over, Wilson. You're right about that, David replied. The investigation into your conduct is just beginning. As Simmons stormed off, a few protesters followed him, but others lingered, looking uncertain. One woman approached David. My son is mixed, she said quietly. Last year, he was detained by police for matching a description. He was terrified. David nodded. Things are changing, ma'am. It won't happen overnight, but they're changing. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Andrew stood beside his father. You know this isn't the end, right? Simmons won't give up so easily. David watched the last protesters walking away. I know, but neither will we. 3 months had passed since that first day in Pine Creek. The small town looked the same from the outside. Same buildings, same streets, same park in the center of town, but something had shifted beneath the surface. David sat in his office reviewing the latest community feedback forms. The Civilian Oversight Committee he created was working, giving people a voice they never had before. Not everyone was happy, but more were than when he started. A knock at his door made him look up. Officer Chen stood there with a file in her hand. The final report on Officer Simmons, she said, placing it on his desk. All 23 complaints over the past 4 years, with witness statements and evidence. David nodded his thanks. The review board meets tomorrow. Any word on how Simmons is taking it? Not well, Chen replied. He's still telling anyone who'll listen that you have a personal vendetta against him. Let him talk, David said. The evidence speaks for itself. After Chen left, David stared out his window at the town square where everything had started. His son had been standing right there when Simmons struck him. Now, 3 months later, the town was still divided, but healing had begun. The door opened again without a knock. Andrew walked in, backpack slung over his shoulder. How was school? David asked. Better, Andrew said with a small smile. Ms. Thompson asked me to help start a student advisory group, to give feedback to the school board about making things more fair for everyone. Pride swelled in David's chest. Despite everything, his son had found a way to turn a painful experience into something positive. The town hall meeting is tonight, David reminded him. You sure you want to go? Andrew nodded firmly. I'm sure. That evening, the town hall was packed. People from all parts of Pine Creek filled the seats. Business owners, parents, teachers, and many faces David had never seen at these meetings before. Mayor Green called for attention. Tonight's meeting will address the findings of our new Civilian Oversight Committee and their recommendations regarding Officer Ray Simmons. A murmur ran through the crowd. Simmons sat in the front row, arms crossed, a few supporters beside him. David and Andrew took seats near the back, wanting to observe more than be seen. The committee chairwoman, Mrs. Washington, a retired school principal who had lived in Pine Creek all her life, stood to present their findings. Her voice was clear and strong as she detailed the pattern of complaints against Simmons over the years. Based on the evidence, including video footage of recent incidents, witness testimonies, and complaint records, we recommend that Officer Simmons be permanently removed from the Pine Creek Police Department. Shouts erupted from Simmons' supporters. "This is a witch hunt," someone yelled. "Order, please," Mayor Green called, banging her gavel. When the room quieted, a man stood up slowly from the middle section. David recognized him as Frank Miller, the owner of the hardware store and one of Simmons' most vocal supporters. "I'd like to say something," Miller said, his voice rough with emotion. The mayor nodded, and Miller turned to face the crowd. "I've lived in this town my whole life. So did my parents and their parents before them. I always thought Pine Creek was just fine the way it was." He paused, his hands gripping the chair in front of him. But after watching that video of Officer Simmons hitting that boy and hearing all these complaints that were just swept under the rug all these years, he shook his head. "I was wrong. We were wrong." Miller turned to look directly at Andra. "Son, I'm sorry for what happened to you, and I'm sorry it took something so awful to open my eyes." The room was silent as Miller sat down. Then another person stood, and another, each sharing similar realizations. Not everyone. Some people walked out instead, but enough to show that real change was happening. As the meeting ended, people stopped to shake David's hand or pat Andra on the shoulder. Officer Chen approached with two other officers. "Chief," she said with a smile, "we wanted you to know that most of us support these changes. We became police officers to help people, not hurt them." Walking home under the stars, Andrew looked up at his father. "Think it'll last?" "After we're gone someday." David put his arm around his son's shoulders. "Change never comes all at once. It happens person by person, day by day, until one day you look around and realize the world is different." As they passed the bookstore where it all began, the owner waved to them from inside. Andrew waved back, no hesitation, no fear. It wasn't perfect. Pine Creek still had problems to solve, but as father and son walked through the quiet streets of their new home, they knew that what they'd started here would continue growing long after tonight. 6 months had passed since that first day in Pine Creek. The leaves had changed color, fallen, and now new buds were appearing on the trees in the town square. Spring was bringing new life to the small town, both literally and figuratively. David sat on a bench in the park, watching kids play basketball on the court. Among them was his son Andra, laughing as he made a shot. The bruises on his face had healed months ago, but David knew the invisible scars took longer to fade. "Mind if I join you?" a voice asked. David looked up to see Captain Taylor, who sat down without waiting for an answer. "Quite a difference from when you first arrived," Taylor said, nodding toward the basketball court where white and black teenagers played together. "Some things change quickly. Others take time," David replied. Just yesterday, the town council had unanimously voted to adopt all of David's proposed police reforms. Body cameras for every officer, community engagement requirements, regular bias training, and most importantly, a civilian review board with real power. "How's the new recruit program going?" Taylor asked. David smiled. "Good. 20 applications so far, more diverse than any previous class." After the investigation, 3 officers including Simmons had been removed from the force. The empty positions needed filling, and David had made sure the recruitment process reached all parts of town this time. On the court, Andra high-fived a white teammate after a good play. The boy was Frank Miller's son, the same Frank Miller who had stood up at the town hall meeting 3 months ago and publicly apologized for supporting Simmons. "Chief, there's something I've been meaning to ask," Taylor said. "That first day, after what happened to your son, why didn't you just fire Simmons on the spot? You had the authority." David watched his son playing. "Because this was never about one bad officer. It was about changing a system. If I just fired him, nothing else would have changed." A woman approached the bench, and David recognized Mrs. Washington from the Civilian Review Board. "Chief Wilson," she said warmly, "I wanted to thank you personally. My grandson told me he wants to be a police officer now. Before you came, he was afraid of them." After she left, Taylor shook his head in amazement. "You know, when the mayor announced she was bringing in an outsider as chief, I thought it would be a disaster." "And now?" David asked. "Now I think it was exactly what this town needed." As the sun began to set, Andrew and his friends finished their game and walked over. "Dad, we're going to get pizza. That okay?" David nodded, handing him some cash. "Be home by 9. As Andrew walked away with his friends, David noticed something remarkable. His son moved through town with confidence now, not fear. He didn't look over his shoulder or tense up when a police car drove by. Later that evening, there was a knock at their front door. David opened it to find Officer Chen standing there with a folder. "Sorry to bother you at home, Chief, but I thought you'd want to see this right away." Inside the folder was a letter from a nearby police academy. They wanted David to come speak about community policing and building trust. Word of Pine Creek's transformation had spread. "They've invited Andrew too," Chen added. "They want to hear his perspective." After she left, David found Andrew doing homework at the kitchen table. "How would you feel about telling your story to some police recruits?" he asked, showing him the letter. Andrew thought about it. "If it helps stop what happened to me from happening to someone else, then I'm in." David looked at his son with pride. 6 months ago, they'd come to this town as strangers, met with hatred and violence on their very first day. Now they were helping to reshape not just Pine Creek, but potentially police departments across the region. That night, as David checked on Andrew before going to bed himself, he found his son sound asleep. No nightmares, no restless tossing. Just peaceful sleep in a room where photos of his new friends were pinned to a bulletin board. On David's desk lay the plans for next month's first ever Pine Creek Community Festival, where the police department would host games and activities rather than just provide security. Officer Chen was organizing it with help from Mrs. Washington and, surprisingly, Frank Miller, who had become one of the department's strongest community allies. Outside, the streets of Pine Creek were quiet and calm. Not perfect, no place ever is, but better. A town slowly healing from old wounds and learning new ways to grow together. David looked out at the starry sky, thinking about how a single moment of injustice had led to months of difficult but necessary change. Sometimes, he thought, the hardest places are exactly where you're needed most.